Hello, comrades. I wanted to make a little addendum to my video about Islamophobia. Some things were brought up in the comments, and it seems that a lot of people misunderstood what I was saying. They didn't really get the point. Although I think that after I responded to some of them in the comments, they did get the point, but I still think it might be useful to make this sort of follow-up video. So my point was that there's no real inherent difference between Christianity and Islam. Like, if there's a moderate Muslim or a moderate Christian, it's pretty much the same thing. If there's a fundamentalist Christian and a fundamentalist Muslim, it's pretty much the same thing. Christian terror groups are pretty much the same thing as Islamic terror groups, and this goes for other religions as well, whether they are, Buddhist or Hindu or Muslim or Christian. The reality is that people have certain views which are based on stereotypes which are not really accurate. Like, people think that Buddhism or Hinduism are, for example, they're like inherently peaceful, which is, I've heard a lot of people say this, that, oh, well, at least Buddhism is like an inherently peaceful religion, or Hindus are inherently peaceful. No, that's not the case at all. There's a lot of far-right Hindu nationalists, and all kinds of like crazy religious Hindu militants. But the same goes for Buddhists. Like, look at all this stuff that the Buddhists did in Tibet when they were still in control in there. They had like serfs, basically slaves, and they basically just abused the hell out of everyone and like publicly beat people and all kinds of stuff like that. But to get to the topic of Islamic terrorism versus Christian terrorism, like somebody said in the comments to of my original video about Islamophobia, they said something along the lines like, you don't see that many Christian fundamentalists or something in the West. And I responded to that by saying that, like in the West there's less fundamentalism in general. I mean, I've never encountered a Muslim fundamentalist. I've encountered one or two Christian fundamentalists, but they are both very rare. Finland might be a pretty good representation of this, because there are not that many Christian fundamentalists and not really Muslim fundamentalists either. In the US, it's of course more biased because there's so many Christians there that of course there's going to be more Christian fundamentalists. But anyway, like, just because you don't see them doesn't mean they don't exist. Like, if you look at countries like Uganda, or like, if in general, just look at third world countries with lots of Christians, there's lots of Christian fundamentalism there. Well, there's lots of Muslim fundamentalism too, but it's not like Christian fundamentalism and Christian extremism just doesn't exist and Muslim extremism is just rampant. Like, because it's not. In poor countries where people don't have education and that have been bombed to shit by the US, like, where they have crazy poverty and exploitation, fascist neo-colonial regimes, and this culture of violence and war and death. Like, in countries like that, like in Africa, ravaged by civil war and famine, there's lots of Christian fundamentalism, like in Congo, places like that. But then again, it's the same thing in the Middle East, but it just happens to be Muslims because there's Muslims living there as opposed to Christians. Because people have this idea that the Quran as a source is just more violent than the Bible, which is just, that was really my biggest gripe with this argument, because that's just such nonsense. I mean, the Bible is just as violent as the Quran. I mean, the same goes for like Christians, Jews, and Muslims. The source material for the holy books are almost identical. The only difference is that, like I said in the previous video, in the New Testament, like, Jesus is slightly different, because Jesus is like a small-scale huckster or a cult leader, but Abraham and Muhammad are more like warlords. So in that sense, the New Testament is slightly different, but still, Christians are supposed to believe in the Old Testament as well. So, but anyway, then to that comment, that I responded to, somebody else responded by saying that, saying something even more outrageous. They said that that you don't hear about these Christian terror organizations, that there's not really these widely known Christian terrorist organizations, while names like, then they listed like Boko Haram and ISIS and Taliban and Hamas and you know, while those are like well-known organizations. I'm like, what the fuck does that have to do with anything? Just because something is well known, it's somehow more like that what does that mean? Like, Leopold II killed like 10 million people in the Belgian Congo. Like literally 10 million people. Not many people know about it. Does that somehow make it not true because people don't know about it? Because it's not as widely known as the Holocaust. I mean, the Holocaust was terrible, but it was 6 million people. Leopold II killed 10 million people in Congo, which, you know, in my opinion, makes it worse. But just because people don't know about it, that has nothing to do with the validity of that. So just because people know about ISIS and people know about Boko Haram and the Taliban, doesn't mean that they're somehow worse than some obscure group that people don't know about. That's not the criteria. Like, how famous a group is not a criteria, especially since, you know, the media has its own motivations. Although, like, for a long time, people were saying that Boko Haram doesn't get enough publicity, and, you know, it didn't actually. Like, originally, it didn't get much publicity. Now it's become a trendy topic to talk about Boko Haram. But just look at the Taliban. I mean, the Mujahideen and the Taliban, nobody said anything negative about them when they were fighting the Soviets. The American media outright called Osama bin Laden a freedom fighter. They said nothing negative about them. But now, there's all this stuff about how Taliban is terrible and, you know, all kinds of bad press about them. Do you think that's just like a coincidence? Al-qaeda became super famous because of the 9/11, but more than 9/11, it became super famous because the American media had to make it into this big boogeyman so that they could justify invading Iraq, even though Iraq had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. But at the time, the American media claimed that Iraq had something to do with Al-Qaeda, even though it was a total lie. But you see, the media has its own motivations in this. The media of the Western countries doesn't really have the same kind of motivation to go after Christian terror groups and make a big deal out of Christian terror groups that they have to make a big deal out of ISIS. Because if they say that ISIS is so dangerous, then that justifies the American intervention in Syria, which is exactly why they are, why Obama is constantly talking about ISIS. They're like, ISIS, ISIS, ISIS. Please let us go and attack Syria. Because ISIS. But yeah, like, Christian terror groups exist. Like, look at the shit that went down in Northern Ireland. I mean, I've heard some people call the IRA a Catholic terrorist organization. Even though that's total bunk. I mean, that's total bullshit. The IRA is not a terrorist organization, nor is it really Catholic. Most of the people in it happen to be Catholic, not all of them, but it really didn't have anything to do with Catholicism. It's just that, Irish people are often Catholic, and it consisted mainly of Irish people. But there's there's the Orange Volunteers and all kinds of, actual far-right religious organizations that terrorized Catholics or terrorized Protestants in that conflict. Then there's the Yugoslav Civil War. Like, look at that. People were killing each other based on ethnic reasons, but also based on religious reasons. There was, Bosnians who were Muslims, largely, and then there were, Serbians and Croats, Catholics and Orthodox Christians killing each other. And that was pretty recently. That's just as recent as the Taliban. More recent, in fact. And again, if you actually look at the stuff that happens in Africa, there's what was it called? The Lord's army, our Lord's Resistance Army, I think it was called. This Christian terrorist movement in Africa. There's tons of them. There's I think there's one in the Philippines. There's also a Muslim religious terrorist organization in the Philippines. Like, I was recently talking to this guy from the Philippines. He wasn't really like, we were both just randomly playing the same video game, and I just started talking to him, and he said he was from the Philippines. So I started asking him some questions. I asked him what he thought about the New People's Army, and it was actually a pretty interesting conversation. He actually said that that he agrees with communism, but he was kind of critical of some of the methods of the New People's Army. Like, he said that it caused that there was a lot of like collateral damage and stuff like that. But that's a whole different topic. But he was explaining that there's these Christian and Muslim organizations that are kidnapping people. So it's not just Muslims; it's all religions pretty much. And the reason there's not as much of this crazy violent extremism coming from Christians, at least seemingly, is because a lot of Christians are living in Western countries which are pretty wealthy and pretty stable and pretty safe, and people in general have a pretty good education. So that's really the difference. That doesn't really have anything to do with the religion. People are just less religious in general. On the topic of like really famous terrorist organizations, do you know what is probably the most famous religious terrorist organization ever? Like, this one everyone's heard of. It's the KKK. They're a Christian terrorist organization. It's just pretty interesting that people don't think of them as a Christian terrorist organization, but that's exactly what they are. People think that they're just randomly racist. Has nothing to do with the Bible, even though the Bible literally supports slavery. Slavery supporters have always tried to justify it using the Bible. And I've never seen any quotes from the Quran which justify slavery. I would be surprised if it didn't justify it. I'm sure the Quran also supports slavery. But people just don't blame Christianity for these things, even when it's so obvious that it's based on Christianity. But they're so quick to point the finger at Muslims and say that, oh, it's obviously because of their religion and their holy book. It's not because of because of civil war or because of poverty or because of ignorance or anything. It just has to be because they're Muslims, and therefore we should just, start locking Muslims up into camps and exterminating them or something. I know I'm like exaggerating, of course, but well, maybe to be honest, I'm not really even exaggerating that much, because there's people like Donald Trump, who is considered a mainstream, like, legitimate presidential candidate, and he's like talking about banning all Muslims.